Our speaker for this evening is going to be on screen. Rabbi Daniel Bogard is one of several rabbis at Central Reform Synagogue in St. Louis, Missouri. Rabbi Bogard will speak about a few things, but is known, has been a fierce advocate in the Missouri State House. Rabbi Bogard has a trans child and has been speaking out in the congregation, out of the congregation, and at the State House for quite some time. So we'll learn from him tonight. Before we do, about an hour before I came to services, I learned very sadly something about one of my colleagues. So 30 years ago when I was ordained, it was conventional wisdom not to be out when you were looking for a congregational job. And so a dear friend of mine wasn't out to the places where he interviewed, but still there were people on the faculty who knew that he was gay, and if you hold up my smicha certificate next to his has signatures missing, right? And truthfully, that went on for years and years. He is happily married for many years and the father of two children, lived in Florida for a number of years and then moved to South Carolina, and in the past few days sent a note to the congregation that said that he loved the congregation and wanted to stay there, but as a gay married man with a trans child, he felt that he couldn't, and that he doesn't know where he's going, but in 8 months' time, he'll resign his position. And so, I don't have to tell you that it's difficult out there and that our hearts break every day. And it's wonderful to have colleagues like my friend who say, this is what I stand for, and I have to stand for it. And like Rabbi Bogard, who is making change every day.
Hi everyone, my name is Rabbi Daniel Bogard. I'm a rabbi at Central Reform Congregation in St. Louis, Missouri, and it is an honor to be with this Beth Emet community for your Pride Shabbat. Even if, we're here virtually, it's still amazing to be with you all. So before I begin by telling you my story, before I tell you what it has been like to be a very proud parent of a trans kid, a congregational rabbi, and live in a state where our government is at war with us, before I tell you about that, I want to tell you the story of Beryl Bela. I want to tell you a story that has changed me in so many profound ways. So we've got to go back to the 1930s, to what has come to be known as the Nazi Olympics. And it turns out that there was this whole phenomenon where athletes were going off and they were competing in the women's games and coming back as men. So there was a huge uproar in the press, throughout the American press, about this whole new trans thing sweeping the nation. Can you imagine? Think about the children. And this old man living in Brooklyn at the time, a Jewish refugee whose family had been ethnically cleansed from Eastern Europe, who had fled the pogroms that were happening in what we would now call Ukraine. This old Jewish man writes a letter to the editor in the Jewish Daily Forward, in Yiddish, right? This is still a Yiddish language newspaper then. And he says, "You crazy people who think this whole trans thing is new, let me tell you the story of Beryl Bela." So he proceeds to tell this story of someone who was born a woman in his shtetl, who was raised as a girl in his shtetl, and yet who never seemed quite comfortable with themselves. And so it said that their name was Bela, that their dad took them to all of the great rabbis. Said, this is my child born as a daughter. What can I do? And the rabbis said, just pray. And so finally, this child was connected with a professor, and we're told that she, and that's how the letter author refers to her at this point, that she went off and studied with a professor, and then that she came back, and this is how our author writes it. He says that she came back, and the whole town came out to greet her, or better said, to greet him. And for the rest of this letter to the editor, remember, this is being written in the 1930s about something that happened in the 1800s. For the rest of this letter, our author talks about Beryl Bela as a man and says that he was welcomed into the community and that he was taught to lead the davening, right? This is in a world where women in this misogynistic, sexist structure wouldn't have even been counted in a minyan. And Beryl Bela, a trans man, is taught to lead the prayers. We're told that Beryl Bela was married off, that he married Rachel. In fact, Rachel with the black hair, so we shouldn't be confused that he married Rachel the redhead, I guess, in down. And the letter ends by saying, and he always had a name as a good, upstanding Jew in our shtetl. So I'll never forget when I first heard that story. I was sitting at a gender equity conference in New York for the Shalom Hartman Institute. This is about 3 weeks before the pandemic, which means it was about 3 weeks before my son came to us and said that he was a boy. But at that point, we had seen it coming. From the very first moments that he could choose anything, he was choosing boys' clothes. He was stealing his brother's clothing and insisting on wearing them. He was always playing with stereotypically boys' stuff, even as we tried to be as non-gendering as possible in how we raised our kids. When he was 4.5, I will never forget this, putting him to bed. He looked me in the eyes and he said, "Daddy, do you think God could make me over again as a boy?" I went back and told my wife, and I don't think I slept that night. So anyhow, even though my son hadn't told us at this point, while I was sitting at that gender equity conference in New York, that he was a boy, I had this sense. And Noam Sienna, the editor of A Rainbow Thread, an incredible collection of queer Jewish texts, was teaching this text about Beryl Bela, and he starts reading it, and I started bawling. I mean, just bawling. I was sitting in a room with 25 other rabbis, and I just couldn't stop crying, and I was the only one having a reaction like this, and eventually they stopped, and someone asked me what was happening. And what I said is that my child has ancestors. And it was so incredibly powerful in that moment to realize that my kid, my trans kid, my son, has ancestors waiting for him in our tradition. Because the truth of it is, you go back 1,800 years and you will find texts in the Mishnah that talk about 6, 7, 8 different sexes. You look at Midrashim from 1,500 years ago that imagine Dinah as a trans woman who God transitioned after her mother's prayers. The normative Jewish understanding of the Adam and Eve story is not that Adam, this mud being, this earth being, was created as a man and Eve split off from him, but instead that male and female God created them as one intersex, non-binary being that was split in half. For thousands of years, this has been the normative way that Jews have understood these texts, because the truth of it is, and the reality of it is, that for as long as there have been Jews, there have been trans Jews, because being trans is just another amazing, wonderful, sacred way of being a human being. So, I've been telling you a little bit about my story, but it's impossible to tell my story without talking politics. And I don't mean to be partisan, but there's one party that has been at war with my family. Because the first thing that you learn when you are the parent of a trans kid and you live in a red state is that your government is coming after your kid and coming after your family. The first thing that you learn when you love a trans young person is that you have to protect them from their government. And so the very first people that I told that my kid was trans, before we told his grandparents, before I think we had even said it aloud, my wife and myself, to each other. We told the General Laws Committee of the Missouri House of Representatives because we knew we had to protect him. I was down in Jeff City, and there were anti-trans bills being heard as well as some anti-abortion bills, and I was there to testify as part of my job in my congregation where I go down. And I hadn't said it out loud, and all of a sudden it hit me. I had to. And so I looked at those members and I said, my name is Daniel Bogard, and I am the proud parent of a trans kid. And my life has really never been the same. Not because my kid is trans, because the thing you got to understand, truthfully, is that like this is the 17th most interesting thing about my son. He's an amazing kid. He's 9 years old. He built his own computer from parts. He does 3D modeling with Blender, which I don't like even really understand what any of that is. He's incredibly smart, and he's social, and he's got so many friends, and he's always sleeping over, and right, I can go on and on and on. And the fact that he's trans hasn't really meant much in our lives is the truth. We know we live in a bubble. We know that not every family and every kid experiences this, but my kid has 4 loving, supportive, amazing ally grandparents. My kid's great-grandmother, my grandma, has asked how much walking there is because she wants to go down to the state capitol to testify in support of her great-grandson. At our synagogue, our amazing, queer, progressive, social justice-oriented synagogue, if anything, and I say this only half-kiddingly, it has made us cooler that we have a trans kid. My kid's school goes to the Jewish day school. The rabbi knit him a kippah in the color of the trans flag for the 1-year anniversary of his transition. And they have sent a senior level administrator or teacher to testify against these bills in Jeff City over and over and over again. And so I tell you these stories because it's important for you to understand that the only bullies in our lives work for the government. For the first few years of going down, we'd go down 2, 3, 4 times, right? And they announce 25 hours in advance for a hearing. And they almost always hold them at 8 a.m. so that you got to drive 2 hours to Jeff City from St. Louis or Kansas City. And you got to leave at 5:30 in the morning to get there. And they do that on purpose. But we would drive down, we would pack those rooms, and there would be 2 or 3 people, quack doctors or white Christian nationalists, who were advocating in favor of these bills. And that would be it, just 2, 3, 4 of them. And then we would have 50 or 60 of us activists there to testify, to pack the room, to stand up for trans kids. And since we're talking to a synagogue, let me tell you about a moment this year where we'd all been there for this 8 a.m. hearing. And afterwards at 11 o'clock, we all were in the hallway for a big group picture, all the activists who had shown up. And on a whim, I shouted out, okay, Jewish community, stay here, let's take a picture. And there were like 5 people who walked away because those who have shown up again and again for trans kids in the state of Missouri and throughout this country have been American Jews. It's really, really been inspiring to see. And it's really the one piece of hope because we go down again and again, and it feels like we are going down to Pharaoh's palace to beg them to leave our kids alone. I come back from these testimony days where the most powerful people in our state are asking 12-year-olds what their genitals look like. Sitting legislators who are talking to our kids and offering to take them away from their parents to protect them from parents who are transing them. You'll have senators who will say that the only reason there are trans kids is because their dads didn't love them enough or their moms didn't love them enough, who view being trans or being queer as a mental illness, as a social contagion, rather than a beautiful, amazing way of being a human being. And so it hurts. You come back from Jeff City and it feels like you've got a hangover from hope, that it's impossible to imagine goodness and light in the world. And so it was on a day like that that I got a call from a congregant who owns a small private Jewish style camp. It's not a Jewish camp, but right, it's Jewish camping minus the Jewish part, even though I think most of the people who go there are Jewish. And he said, hey, what do you think about doing a week-long camp for trans kids? And I don't think he was expecting quite the intensity of response that he got from me, because by the end of that call, we had a camp. So I called up my dear lifelong friend, Shira Berkowitz, who's an activist and employee at Promo, our statewide LGBTQ org that organizes here in Missouri. And I said, Shira, we gotta do this. And so we got a few other folks who are trans. The entire committee was trans that put camp together, other than myself, as the parent of a trans kid. We thought we were going to get 20 campers to Camp Indigo Point. By the way, you can read about us at campindigopoint.org. We thought we'd get 20 campers. And instead, we had to go count the bunks that we had and discovered that we could have 97 campers. We had 60 kids on the waiting list. Kids came from 27 states last year. 97 kids, 27 states in our first year. We had a kid come from Alaska. So right now, while I am recording this, there's 150 campers from 30 plus states who are at our camp for LGBTQ kids. We have 150 transgender expansive and queer kids who are surrounded by 55 LGBTQ counselors and staff who are singing and swimming and going to campfires. And the thing of it is, I think it's the best thing I've ever been a part of. Because if you know anything about trans kids, you know the rate of suicidality. And the thing that brings that down, the thing that brings the suicide rate for trans kids down to almost the same as their non-trans peers, is a single loving, supportive, affirming adult. Which breaks my heart to think about how many of these kids don't have that. But if a single adult does that, can you imagine what 2 weeks of camp does to these kids' souls? We have these notes from parents that they send saying that our camp saved their kids' lives, that they sent off children who were depressed and isolated and turned in on themselves, and they received back kids who were proud of who they were, who are thriving, who have light in their eyes because, well, let me give you this image. When you talk to a lot of trans people, the piece they tell you that they miss the most from before they transitioned was swimming. Think about it. As a trans person, as a visibly trans person, you can imagine why going to a swimming pool might be so anxiety and trauma inducing. Right? Both internal senses of body dysmorphia and feeling like your body on the outside may not look like what you wish it did, which I think so many of us can understand to a lesser extent when it comes to putting on a bathing suit. But it's also the fear of being ridiculed, of being pointed at and laughed. The real fear of being targeted. And so last year, about a third of our kids came with notes that said they weren't going to swim. And every kid goes swimming. Every kid chose to go swimming. Because they showed up down at the pool, and not only were there no eyes there to judge them, but they looked around, and everywhere they looked, all of the campers looked like them. And when they looked at the side sitting on the deck were the counselors who were playing on their phones rather than being with the campers, as you know happens at camp, those people looked like them. And when they looked up at the lifeguard chair, those people looked like them. And when they saw the administrator who was walking around to check and make sure everything was working and going smoothly, they looked like them. And so I really believe it. There will be kids who will grow up to be thriving adults because they had this camp. And I really believe it. There will be kids who will be alive, who will have hope in the future because they had 2 weeks of a place like this. So we so appreciate you having me. and so appreciate. You can find out more about camp, by the way, at campindigopoint.org, and would love for your community to look into being a faith sponsor. We have a program we call Faith Partners of Camp Indigo Point, where congregations, and I should say it's like 90% synagogues, make a somewhat substantial donation to make sure that we can support scholarships and security costs and staffing costs. And so would love to include you all on that if that's something you're interested in. And just thank you for doing this work. Thank you for being in it. Thank you for standing up for trans kids. And remember that maybe the easiest way that you can save a life is that when you are around kids, that you be vocally and lovingly inclusive of trans voices and of pronouns and of normalizing the existence of trans people in spaces. Because there will be a kid in that room who is trans and who knows it and knows that they're not allowed to tell anyone, who will have hope because of you. Shabbat Shalom.
Wow. What a privilege to listen, to sit in the community and listen, and also what a privilege to know what kind of community we exist in. Many of you know that I teach in our religious school, and I've taught this past year was my 4th year. And in 4 years, there were 2 children who were transgender and many others who were gender expansive. And at the beginning of this year, I chose to put up a pride flag in my room. It was not an easy thing to do, those of you on the building committee, but we did it. And when my 6th graders walked in this year, I remember that one of them looked at the flag and looked at me and looked at the flag again and just said, "Whoa, slay." And I sort of feel like it's the least I can do, right? You walk into the 6th grade, and you know, if you haven't known before, that Beth Emet embraces you. And I don't have to say it, because you just know it. I hope that we can be in our community the kind of model that Rabbi Bogard is, and that we can choose to love everyone who walks in the door, and not just love them, but celebrate them and know, maybe they'll grow up to slay. We